Alrighty. Hey everybody, welcome to an unusual Friday night. Usually you're used to Tyler and Faith Unaltered stuff, and today the ladies are taking over and we are going to do Hebrew Bible breakdown on a Friday instead of on a Wednesday. But we thought it would be fun to come over and do it tonight because we're going to be talking about the Amazon series House of David. And we're also going to get into a little bit of biblical storytelling. So we asked Josh to come join us in our takeover of Friday at Hebrew Bible Breakdown because he is the master storyteller. And we are we are going to be talking a lot about storytelling. So we thought who better to join us than our master storyteller down here. So Courtney, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to talk about this tonight. It was really fun watching through this week, knowing that we were going to be doing an episode on it. It kind of gave new stakes to watching the episodes, so pretty fun. And I know the people here who are used to listening to us talk about nerdy things are also excited about it too for that reason. So get our nerdy take on that. Hopefully it's good.
Yep. Josh, how are you? Welcome to Hebrew Bible
Um,
Breakdown. This is your
Yeah,
first
first
time on
time.
our segment.
yeah, this is cool. It's a weird flip flop for me. I didn't have to intro an episode. That was
Mhm.
cool. Yeah, it's actually kind of leisurely to sit back and just be part of the furniture here. It's nice. I kind of maybe I'll do this more often, huh?
Hey, absolutely. We have a good time over here talking about all kinds of nerdy stuff. So,
Yes, this is true.
yeah, this has been absolutely crazy. So, yeah, I've got company in town. So, Jamie Russell, everybody's favorite SDA
Yeah.
heretic, is visiting me down here today, this weekend. So it's been really fun running around with him. And school is crazy, and it's been really fun. So the other day I was started watching this series that popped up on my Amazon feed, and I got like 5 minutes into the first episode and I messaged Courtney. I was like, Courtney, we have to talk about this show. This is amazing. Like has it a whole lot of levels, good and bad. I think there's a lot of
Mhm.
good, and there's some things that I definitely was cringing and rolling my eyes over a few over a few things that happened in that show. But we really had, like, I loved and just enjoyed the experience of watching this and spent some time to just, enjoy as much as possible the the experience of the thing. So I'm going to take just a minute and just do really quick overall first impressions of the show, and then we're going to jump into some things that really caught our attention, good and bad. And then we're
Yeah.
going to talk, transition to that after that into just biblical storytelling in general. So, Courtney, what did you think of House of David?
Yeah, so just to give the audience a warning, we're not going to do like a blow by blow, scene by scene kind of thing. We're just giving general impressions and again thinking about, what are some of those details that you can pick up on a biblical narrative that do fill out the story more than you would normally, you know, take at first glance. So I'm with you on that, Amber. Like it's interesting whenever you see like what I feel like in this case is actually a good portrayal of biblical narrative come to life. There are some parts that, like we said, we let in with on the thumbnail cringe or cool. There are a
Mhm.
couple of things that if you just have read enough ancient Near Eastern stuff that you're like, I don't know if that's exactly how I'd portray that. But overall, it was kind of neat entering into this world and being
Mhm.
able to see it come to life, because we get to imagine these stories all the time as we're reading them. And I think of, something like, Charlton Heston's portrayal of Moses and Mount Sinai and stuff like that to me is like a really great example of a biblical story come to life, even if there aren't things there that I would these days love, but it's just so epic that it draws you in and it makes you want the story to be real. And so that's kind of how I felt. My first impressions of House of David was like, there's some things where you're like, that's not how I picture
Mhm.
it. But then overall, it was really cool to see the world. And I did feel like we were being drawn into kind of that chaotic environment of kings being overthrown, their power kind of being precarious, and what that's like to have neighboring nations kind of threatening your throne all the time. So I did feel like we got that feel of what I imagine the kind of ancient Near East or daily life, maybe not daily life, but the political life in the ancient Near East kind of playing out as. So those are some of
Mhm.
my first thoughts. We'll get into more details, but yeah, first impressions
Yeah.
was it was kind of fun.
All right, Josh, what did you think of the show?
Well, I thought first off, like I kind of want to be careful and like spoiler alert for people who are watching, because I'm one of those people that doesn't like to be the surprises to be ruined. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
if we bomb it and say something overt and like ruin it for you, sorry, but hopefully you've watched some of this at
I'm
least.
making no
And if
promise.
not, I suppose we'll say enough to entice, but not to ruin it, But I think that it was my first impression was actually of the musical score. I was
Mhm.
genuinely
Mhm.
deeply impressed, not only as a musician. I was telling these lovely ladies here, I was telling them that I am a musician and I play a lot of instruments and I'm very passionate about music. I love it very much. And I am in a worship ministry at my church as well. And so music is integral for me in a lot of things. And I thought it was really fantastic the way that they were able to use the kind of tone and texture and bigness and quietness and subtleties and things like that.
Mhm.
It was very well thought out. And so one of the things that I first admired about this is that the entire thing felt like all of it was on purpose. None of it was on accident. It was not a show that was thrown together. It was a show that was very well executed. And so even if I was going to make historical scruples as you could toward particular portrayals of one thing or another, or how you would maybe reverse the order of this or that event or something like that. Like, I think overall their execution of what they were trying to do was really fantastic. I was genuinely impressed because, as we all are probably aware, the Christian media industry has not been the best in the world for very long, and so it's rather interesting to see something that's very well made, but not something that's exclusively on a Christian content outlet, right? And so it's something that is overtly biblical, right? But it is on a on Prime Video. It's not on a Christian website. It's not
Mhm.
on Angel Studios or whatever. So I was the things that I was really blown away by was that it violated my expectation in the right ways. You know what I mean? I thought that was really great. And beyond the music, the imagery was absolutely fantastic. Some of the remarkable symbolism and structures to how they structured the scene, the lighting, things like that. Super, super well executed. I was really impressed. Um, I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's
Wait.
always easy with a project like this to like go in and just tear it down, and kind of find ways to nitpick it because there are definitely ways we could do that. But you're right; it is just exciting to see something well executed that isn't just interesting from like because we're Christians, so we want to watch it, but it kind of has those like fantasy vibes of a fantasy TV show. Um, all right. So Amber, what were
Mhm.
your like initial thoughts and impressions, or do you want to get into kind of how they decided to lay out the story?
Yeah, well, just initially I was hesitant because I am like a very hesitant fan of The Chosen, and there's some things that I get very cautious with this kind of thing, and I overall went in expecting to hate to love it, and I actually can't decide if I hate loving it or love hating it. Like
Mm-hmm.
it was a really conflicting, but I overall was more positive than negative. But that's just because I get technically picky about certain things, and that's just my own hangups on on
Yeah.
details of things that but overall I really did enjoy it more than I had some gripes. I think just diving into the show itself, one of the things that I really liked, that impressed me the most about this show was the world that they took you into, because I think it's hard in our context for us to understand how chaotic the ancient world was, and that the time period that we see in most of the Old Testament was a time of chaos, and that God was supposed to be the bringer of order, and that was one of Israel's roles in going into the promised land and being a light to everyone around, and showing Yahweh to the nations around, was supposed to be the light of order, not the bringer of chaos. And so to show that, I think they did very well in bringing that portrayal into the show, and the feel, and you could just feel the angst in every layer there of all of the players, the citizens, even the sheep. I mean, like, it just, the whole thing felt anxious because you could just the chaos that was reflected. And that was like the big thing that really kind of struck me first overall for the 3 episodes together. They dropped the 4th one this morning, and I watched about half of it, and then had to kind of abandon ship because of time. But I'm gonna go back and finish it later. But yeah, I would like to get like your guys' impressions, like just overall of the overall 3 episode story. What kind of struck out to you guys?
Joshua, do you want to start since you're our guest on the show?
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
I was waiting for my name to get
before
called.
we
Man.
go, I love the fact that they dropped 3 episodes and they're dropping one every week, because it
Yeah.
prevents you from just binging, but then
Yep.
it also doesn't make you wait like forever to get like to the next episode. So I really like that. So
Yep.
personally, go ahead, Joshua or Josh. Do you like Josh better than Joshua?
You know what? As long as you don't, it's fine. Josh is fine. I have a lot of nicknames, to be honest with you, so I've gotten used to being called just about anything.
Right now, I'm thinking of all these Hebrew Bible names, and I am somewhat confused as to like why they decided to call Jesse Jesse, and then like Abner Avner. Like why they go with the Hebrew pronunciations of something. So I think I have like all these Hebrew names in my head.
Yeah.
So I'm like Joshua, the whole thing.
Right. That's fair. Fair enough. I have a very biblical name, which is weird because my mom didn't have that in mind when she named me, but I have a very, very deep biblical name. Yeah. My middle name is Leroy, by the way, which is the king in French.
The king. Joshua the king.
Joshua the king, son of David.
Son of David.
Yeah, really,
very royal.
Interesting. Yes. So yeah, as far as the overall structure of the 3 episodes, I didn't finish the 3rd episode just out of the lack of time, like you said. I didn't get to the 4th episode or anything, but it's difficult because I don't have a lot of time and attention to sit down and watch a show. It's easier to listen to things because I do that throughout the day, but this is something that, like I said, it was so involved, so well done that it wasn't something that you don't grant your full attention to, so that at least that much, like that's something along with the first impression, is that it really held my attention, which is saying a lot because I have very little attention to hold. Let me tell you, I get distracted so easily. And so being able to sit down and watch a show like that and have it hold your attention that way is genuinely good. But also it was the first couple episodes were ultimately in, let's say, like the first couple of scenes were a really good, like quick 1-2 punch of what you can expect from the rest of the show, which I thought they did very, very well. The way that they laid out the conflict between David and Goliath as the most obvious low-hanging fruit, but a really well done tease, because they didn't give you enough. They really didn't. They stopped right at a part where you're like, this is getting weird. Okay, I didn't expect them to do that, because that's not in the, oh, wait a minute. Okay, we'll come back to that later, I guess, like, then you get dragged into the immediacy of the story in this kind of, almost a Stephen King jumping back and forth between times kind of situation. And so I thought it was really clever to have this play on, where it's going, but you don't know how it's getting there, because they're acknowledging that it's, it's built on a text that everyone has access to, and so it's not like you don't know what's going to happen. You kind of know what's going to happen, and so I think they did well trying to keep a guest to a story that everybody can have ready access to. That's pretty laid out for us. And so the way that I thought most impactful in the first episode particularly is the obviously the condemnation of Saul for his disobedience, right? This drawing out of the because they're having a party. They had a victory. They have this victory. They're Israel. They're the people of God, and they can't be stopped. Like, they're just conquering evil lands and opening it up for God God's people to be fruitful and multiply, right? And so they're very excited and they're partying and they're all happy and everything, but their king has been disobedient in a very subtle but important way, right? And it's so they did very well to make an emphasis on the corruption of the people through the subtlety of their, like, even such a small, seemingly small disobedience, and this flippancy, the attitude that some of them had toward it. And then the way that they contrasted that with the obvious presence of holiness when Samuel shows up. And so I thought the way that they were able to portray the contrast between flippancy and celebration and seriousness and weight, which is ultimately glory, in a way that we often don't feel like thinking about it, right? But the glory of God appeared and it made them sorrowful. You know what I mean? And so that being the opening to this story is very impactful for me. I think that was probably the biggest thing that caught on to me, was that this was an emphasis. And immediately in storytelling, it's very difficult to make an emphasis on holiness. That's not an element that people often can bring to a story and make it feel natural. But this felt like it was integral to what was happening in the story, and so kudos to them.
Did you have anything in that first episode that you were like, because they dropped some things that are outside the Bible, some details that are outside the Bible, that you were like, oh, I don't know about that, or that gave you hesitancy with how they portrayed it?
Yes and no. I mean, none of them that would bother me enough to think that I would have to question their motives or anything as like a writer. I don't think the people in their art as they're making it are thinking we're going to subvert the Bible. Look at this. Like I think what they're doing is trying to expand intuitively rather than add to eisegetically. And so I don't feel like they damaged the content of the story by doing so. And so I wouldn't point to any one thing that kind of damaged the content of the story necessarily, but there were some things that I was like, like the opening scene. Honestly, the opening scene with the throwing of the spears and David gets knocked down, but then at the same time, it's like, okay, he's on the ground and it's kind of an inverse picture of Saint Michael and the dragon. So I get it. Like, this is really interesting. The enemy has us pinned. Like, that's a great way to open the story as well. And so I like their use of contrasts, I guess is what I'm getting at. I really like their use of contrasts because it's something that I think serves well and does an easy job of showing exactly what it is that's happening and why it's happening. And it leaves a lot of the things that should be unsaid and implicit allowed to be unsaid and implicit. You know what I mean? And I think that that's something that's really crucial to good story, is you can't hand too much to the audience. It feels patronizing. You can't hand us everything. You have to leave some of it this smoke and mirrors mystery. They do a good job walking that line.
Right.
Yeah,
I agree. It's like, okay, we know David's going to fight Goliath and we kind of know the end of that. But the fact that they leave you they start with that, like, hey, this is where we're heading, and kind of take you out of that scene almost immediately and back up in David's life. I did think was pretty cool. What about you, Amber? Anything in that first episode that you were like, oh, I like this or I don't like that?
I think telling a familiar story is difficult, especially one that you already know the ending to. I remember when way back when Titanic came out, I was like, hey, I was trying to get my dad to go see it. It's like, why should I go see it? I know how it ends. The ship sinks. End of story. I can save my money, right? So since this is such a familiar story to so many of us, trying to make one that will buy you in. Exactly.
I mean, there was some prudence to that, I have to admit.
But, because we all know this, a lot of us who are familiar with the Bible know the story of Samuel and Saul and David. And so we know how it all ends. And so getting one that can grab your attention that way that it did, I appreciated. And I think the first episode did a really nice job of pulling out and giving hints to some themes that I really like the chaos in the ancient Near East world, the pattern of pride and arrogance and idolatry and where that goes. Like, it's going to be fun to see where they take
that. Was so good. I thought that was amazing. How they did that.
And the theme of God will not be mocked was amazing that they started pulling on that thread. Like, I was just just like, wow, thank you for pulling that out, because I think we miss that a lot
Yeah.
in a lot of modern church contexts and preaching. Like, it's just
Mhm.
not something you hear as much. So I loved that they started, just seeing some of these themes being pulled out, and calling Samuel the seer, I thought was also very, very interesting. So I'm interested to see how they pull that out and differentiate that, because most of us just think of him as a prophet, and there's that interesting back and forth between seer and prophet, and the names and when they're used and when they're not used, which is one of those technical nerdy things that
Mhm.
it was kind of fun to see how they tease that out as well. But overall, yeah, they set up some really epic themes in that first
Mhm.
episode there, that to see how they chase that down in the rest of the episodes coming out, that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, I thought the way that they kind of portrayed the spiritual world as being real, and that
Mhm.
they all believe this, and that they believe that they're interacting with it, and that their actions have consequences. Saul
Yep.
defying the word of the Lord and bringing back Agag, and I love the fact that they pronounce his name again. It's like, why do they pronounce Agag,
Right.
which is how you pronounce it in Hebrew, but then they just keep on saying like Samuel or Jesse, instead of Yishai or Shmuel. So yeah, I'm just like, we could go one way or the other on that. That's kind of just a little pet peeve, but I understand why. I guess they're kind of, too big of a deal. But the fact that he kind of looked a little crazy, and they kept on calling them like blood drinkers, which is what Amalekite means, and shows that, they had this cannibalistic kind of culture, like, and that there were real serious spiritual consequences to Saul defying the word of the Lord. And
Mhm.
like, kind of the way they did the spirit of the Lord leaving Saul and then him being tormented by an evil spirit was a little Hollywood demon to me, but it still was good, I thought.
Mhm.
So I really enjoyed that. In terms of some of the extra biblical material, I was actually really excited to see Nitzevet. So this might
Mhm.
get into what we want to talk about, um, like after we get done talking about the show itself, and just like, how do we read Hebrew narrative? How do we engage Hebrew narrative? And what are faithful ways to do that? Because I
Mhm.
think a lot of us have been raised on if it's in the Bible, you can't really touch it, and we can't really imagine anything outside of what's there in
Right.
the Bible. And so having Nitzevet, David's mom, there, and some of the lore around her could really offend people who are more of an evangelical bent, to say, well, we can't speculate on the Bible. But realistically, that is what Jewish interpreters have always done. And because they see and I'll post this link here in the comments. I really like this podcast by Ari Lamb. He's a Jewish rabbi, and he's talking with Drew Johnson, who's an Old Testament scholar. He's a Jewish rabbi who's also an Old Testament scholar himself, and he talks about how Jews read the Bible and how Christians could benefit from reading the Bible a little bit more like Jews. And he's talking in that podcast about the story of Joseph. So I'll run through this example really quickly, but I think it's perfect. So, because this is kind of how I was raised to think about reading Old Testament story as well, coming from a Jewish background. And even though I was like being raised in a Christian home, but my dad's Jewish and stuff like that. So you come to the text and you're like, why did they leave that detail? And you imagine yourself in the text. And as you're imagining yourself in the text, there are natural things that if you just kind of understand the human condition, that would, like, you would do this thing. And so then you're like, well, why didn't that happen? And you begin to draw from other parts of the text. You recognize that the Bible does have design patterns, and there are patterns. And so you can even use details from other stories that seem similar to this story to give you insight into this one. And so he uses the story of Joseph, and he asked the question, which is, again, what, like, I asked this question reading through the Old Testament when I was like 13, is like, why did Joseph not contact his family when he was raised to the highest, second to the highest place in Egypt? He had all the power, like Canaan is not that far away from Egypt. He knows his family is still alive. Why didn't he reach out to them? So you ask that question, and then you look back through the Joseph story, because you're like, well, that would only make sense if he's crying and so excited about the reunion
Mm.
at the end of Genesis. Then surely he had a longing to be with his family. So why didn't he do it? And so what you get in the history of Judaism are these stories about these people. And some of them probably are preserving actual historical details that are passed down, but not in the text. And then other ones are are kind of good inferences to the best explanation from biblical text. But what Ari Lamb says in that podcast, and I like I said, just go listen to it because it's really good. But he says, up until this point in the story, Joseph has heard the story of Abraham and the story of Isaac, and now he's in the Jacob narrative. And he also heard the story of Cain and Abel. And he always knew that there was one son who was chosen and then one son who was not chosen, right? And had to go off and live in exile by himself, right? So like Abel was the son who was chosen. Cain is the one who goes off into exile. Isaac is the one who was chosen. Ishmael goes off into exile. And so same with Esau and Jacob. And so he initially interprets those dreams of himself as that he's the one who's chosen to pass on this lineage. But then once he goes off to Egypt, he, number one, like think about it from his perspective. His dad is the one who sent him to tend the sheep by himself, you know, and then his brothers come up and throw him in a pit, and he has no clue that his brothers made this decision on their own. So he's thinking maybe his dad sent his brothers to them and, you know, kind of orchestrated this set of events. So he's thinking maybe I'm the one who's supposed to go off in exile. Maybe I misunderstood these dreams. And so that's why he doesn't contact his family once he is risen to a place of leadership in Egypt. And then whenever his brothers come and he overhears them saying, we have to leave Benjamin behind, because if we don't leave him behind, our father will never survive because he never got over Joseph. And that little detail, our father would never survive because he never got over Joseph, tells him that his father actually wanted him to stay in the family. Like his father wasn't sending him away. Right. So that's like kind of the Jewish lore that develops around the Joseph story. So when it comes to Nitzevet and the David story, and like, you know, they really hit the bastard theme like over the head really hard in that first episode. Like, you know, you're a bastard over and over and over again, and slapping him in the face.
Yeah.
But the reason why is because of some of the Psalms that we have related to David. And even, you know, the scene of him being anointed there in Exodus 3, I mean, in episode 3, was that, like, you know, they bring before all the sons of Jesse, and none of them are going to be the anointed one. And then they're like, well, do you have any other son? Well, Jesse kind of assumes that David's not his son. And so then they go and grab David. And so, yeah, so I thought it was interesting how they brought Nitzevet into that. And so then his anointing is proof that he's also a biological son of Jesse. And let's see, let me pull this Psalm up because it, you know, it's just good for pulling that up there. So yeah, in the Psalms, like he says that he's a stranger to his brothers. And that word for stranger is from the same root as the word for bastard or illegitimate offspring. So, you know, they're pulling on different texts there to, you know, these Jewish kind of lores or things like that are not just made up. They're reading, they're native Hebrew readers of the text. And so they're pulling on all the information that we normally would. They just are noticing different things because they're reading it in Hebrew. So that's kind of my long rant on that. I don't know what you guys thought about that.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. It's one of those things that we'll get more into this, I think, later after we get into more of the biblical storytelling itself, that, you know, it strikes me that, especially in like the evangelical world, that they're almost allergic to imagination. So how dare you touch, you know, there's a lot of feedback of things like The Chosen or House of David or some of these series where it's like, it's not word for word out of the King James Version. How dare you? This is terrible, you know? And it's one of the things I think as I've been spending a lot more time interacting in church history lately, because I've been forced to with some of my schoolwork. And that's one of the sad things I think that's gotten lost in the progression of modern Christianity is the theology of art and the theology of beauty, and how do we interact with that? And so if you're evangelical and many forms of Protestant, you have no framework for how to deal with theology, how to deal with imagination, how to deal with interacting with these stories in a way that's not a word for word reading of the text. And so, like, I think it's a very sad thing that we've lost. And I think this is one of those areas where some of our more high liturgy brothers and sisters have a little bit of an advantage on some of us, because they have interacted for thousands of years with art and with beauty and with imagination in a way that modern evangelical Protestants haven't. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other in this area about how to do that, because some of us just don't have a theology of art and beauty that is absolutely missing in our inability to interact with material like a House of David, which, I have my nitpick gripes, but overall, I think they, for the most part, really did a nice job trying to walk that line of fealty to the story, but imagination and bringing in to life something that for us is very, two-dimensional flat, because all we can do is read it. We can't go step into that world. And so it's really a difficult balance to walk. Josh, what are you thinking down there?
I like the introduction of beauty and sacred spaces to things like I really appreciate it. Like I said, the visuals, the imagery that they used, especially in that first episode, was very impactful. I'm not gonna lie. Like the spoiler alert, just anybody here, I'm going to be explicit. The scene where Samuel is taking care of the Amalekite king. Right. And he walks up to him and he's like, "Why have the gods come here?" He said, "The one true God has come." You know what I mean? He's like, "Well, surely Saul's wrath is past." He's like, "Yes, but God's wrath has not."
Oh,
And
so
then
good.
he shockingly violent scene.
Very much.
Not gonna lie. I expected a cutscene. There was not a cutscene. There was a hacking scene, and I was genuinely surprised. And my prudish nature and pearl clutching self sat there and watched it and didn't complain, because that was what happened in the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? The prophet Samuel cleansed the house.
Yep.
That's what the priest is meant to do. And instead of using incense, he used a sword and did the same exact thing, which is what is meant to be represented by some of the imagistic beauties that are present in the more liturgical churches. Those kind of things are meant to be participatory remembrances, in the same way that Courtney last week was talking about eating the bitter herbs and the things that you would partake in for Passover as a remembrance of the time of slavery in Egypt. It's like, why would you bring these negative elements into ritual? It's like, because real life is real. That's why. Because it's real. That was a terrifying scene. I'll be honest with you. Like, it was genuinely real feeling, and then as Samuel turns around with a noticeably murderous, blood-stained face, having just executed serious justice, turns around, says exactly what Amber brought out: God is not mocked, while dragging a sword to create a line in the sand. The most exact that image right there, that scene was exactly right. It was exactly right.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And talking about, iconographic exegesis, right? Or iconographic beauty. When you're looking at those icons, I do think it's interesting that even Baptists, like if they have a book, like Baptist scholars, if they have a book, they'll go and grab an icon and put it on the cover of their book, or some like ancient religious art. Here's one right there by a Baptist. But there are those things and icons that make you question, is that actually a part of the story? Like an image placed in the icon that makes you wonder, is that a part of the story? And it's not a part of the story, but what that image is doing is connecting it back to another similar story. So so that you think about them both at the same time, that this pattern is now overlapping. And whenever Samuel did that, like that honestly made a connection for me in my mind. I had not. And so Josh, like, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's exactly what happened after the disobedience at Sinai. And there was a line drawn in the sand, right? All the ones who would not repent were on one side, and then the sons of Levi executed justice, right? And then the same thing with the sons of Korah, where they fell into the earth, right? Like there's a line drawn between those who are faithful and those who are not. So that like sword dragging in the sand, and Samuel being the priest who executes justice, because we just don't think of priests like serving in that role. It's much easier for us to imagine Samuel praying to God, being the kind of mystic that he is throughout the rest of the episodes. But that image right there for me took me right back to the calf, the disobedience of the golden calf, in a way that I had not necessarily made that connection before. So I thought that was really cool from that perspective.
Yeah. And
My
I
wife
think that
was
brought out,
I was like,
yeah,
is that what happened in the Bible? And Tim's like, yeah, that's what happened. And I
Yep,
looked up,
that's
like,
what happened.
he cut him to pieces. And I was like, oh
Yep.
yeah, he didn't just kill him. He like, it
Mm-mm.
says he cut him to pieces, you know, so
Yep.
that's crazy.
Terrifying.
And that scene too really brought back into mind as I've been working on some projects for my channel, and have been, before I'd answered some questions about violence in the Bible and why we see things that look like violence and genocide and some things that are intolerable to our modern sensibilities. And I thought their portrayal of that, of the king and his, calling out the fact that they were sorcerers and cannibals, and just the evilness that existed in what was happening there, and how infectious that is. And that has to be purged. And so because there are things that are worse than death. And I think they did a nice job of pulling that out in a subtle way, that if you really kind of think about, they couldn't let him live because he's casting spells that are affecting the children of God. Like, it just really, to me, I'm like, that right there is what I'm trying to explain to people when I'm talking about why violence is in the Bible and why evil is in the Bible. Like, it's infectious. If you're not guarded and holy, it's infectious. So I really appreciated the fact that they actually pulled that out, because you don't see that very often. People touch that at all. And I thought they did a nice job subtly bringing your attention to that.
In a related but also not related note to what you just said, it's not from the show that we're discussing now, but in a poetic sense covers the same subject matter. In The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis has a scene between a woman who is in heaven, who is in love with the Christ, and she is absolutely shining with glory and holiness, and she's in joy. Nothing can break her joy. And her husband, who is on an excursion out of hell, is meeting her in heaven, and she's trying to evangelize him so that he would stay in heaven with her. And he's trying to unevangelize her, that she would return back with him to hell. And she's like, no, but you can stay. But I'm in love now. And I'm sorry for everything I've done. But I'm in love now. And then Lewis, after this conversation happens, is rather embittered and says, why is it that she's allowed to be so unmoved by this pitiful creature? And the guy who's trying to pitch his wife, you should come back to hell with me so that we can be in love, is rather pitiful. And so Lewis is like, why is she not having pity? Why is her heart of stone? And he's like, her heart is not of stone. Her heart is satisfied. It is full. Manipulation has no hold on her. Did you think that evil would forever have a hold by way of your pity, and manipulating your emotions forever? Or would evil finally be done away with and good have its say? And so it's like, in a poetic sense, it's the same sort of thing. The cleansing is a power of its own, and so I think it's not just the ceremonial uncleanness, it's also the, like, this contagion sort of element, and I think that it's interesting because I've been exposed by way of our friend Spencer to a model of atonement that he calls ambulatory, which is like the idea that God is like doing like a sacred blood transfusion for humanity through the Christ, like to take the contagion and remove it and replace it with something else, not merely just a removal, but a replacement, and so it's kind of interesting to see those things play out in such a concrete way, because Samuel is now terrifying, like, but he's so gentle, and he's so calm. He sounds like the first Dumbledore.
I was gonna say somewhere between Dumbledore and Gandalf a little bit.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And so it's like and I really love that contrast. Again, it's just like this gentle man who is also a fierce weapon in the hand of God, and so it's like Samuel and David in that episode being paralleled, during the killing of the Amalekite king being exactly parallel to the timing of David slaughtering the lion who had killed the sheep. And so David is cleansing the flock, and so is Samuel simultaneously. It's absolutely just brilliant.
Yeah. I think they did. Yeah, they did a beautiful job handling some of these tougher things that we don't see addressed a lot. And because, we're so, I think a lot of people who grew up with the New Testament focused, and isn't Jesus lovely and nice, and we should all get along, and Jesus is love, and not interacting with the Old Testament in a significant kind of way, have a hard time seeing the fact that prophets did some terrible things. And, the people of God were called to do some terrible things sometimes that seems like to us, if you're not used to that, interacting in that way. And so, I love that they pulled some of that out, and,
or some just weird things too.
Yeah.
Like prophets did a lot of weird things that don't get any airtime.
Right.
We'll sing what Isaiah wrote at Christmas. We won't talk about the fact that he walked around naked for a while,
Right. Or Ezekiel, the real recipe for Ezekiel bread, like
yeah.
That shocks some people when you bring that up. Like
poo.
They don't tell you that. They don't tell you that when you buy it at the store.
Right. I'm like,
or Jeremiah shaming everybody with his dirty underwear,
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Or even the priest's instructions to be fully clothed so you didn't accidentally moon or expose your genitals to God when you're offering sacrifices. Like, there's some stuff in there that people just kind of just like, wait, what? That's
God will not be mocked, as God will not be mooned.
Right. God will not be mooned. That's for sure.
Yeah. Awesome. We got Shannon on the watch list. That's awesome. So one of the things, I've actually done some work on the narrative patterns in Samuel and things like that. And so what you're talking about, Joshua, that Samuel and David are kind of parallel here, and Saul is kind of like this foil, actually plays itself out in the biblical narrative and in ways that you can't really see unless you kind of know Hebrew. So I'm going to give us a little bit of Hebrew insight because, why not? This is what we signed up for with Hebrew Bible
Breakdown. That's right.
But
you need a soundboard with a metal sound.
I know that's what we're going with the breakdown. Was kind of like, what's that? Yeah. But so Saul's name in Hebrew is Shaul. Okay, Shaul. That's how you pronounce it. There's not an S, or it's a SH sound. So there's not an SH sound in Greek. So then all the SHs just get made into S's. So his name is Shaul, and the Hebrew verb sha'al means to ask for something, to request. So Saul's name literally means the one who was asked for. That's what his name means, the one who was asked for. And so that's exactly what happens. The people ask for a king, and then they go and find the one who was asked for, Shaul. But in Samuel's story in 1 Samuel chapter 1, his mother Hannah Sha'al's God for a son. So she asked God for a son, and God Sha'al's her request. He gives her request. You don't see it in Hebrew because, again, it's Hebrew does some weird things with verbs. So he gives her request. And so then what she does is she goes and Sha'al's Samuel back to God. And she says, he is Shaul. He is lent back to God. So Samuel is kind of set up there in 1 Samuel chapter 1 as an opposite and equal Saul. He's the one who is asked for, but her request is called righteous by Eli. And so then she's given more sons. Right? So Samuel was asked for, and he's a good prayer request, basically. So God gives her prayer request, and then she's blessed with more sons. Well, then when the people pray and ask to God for Saul, God gives them their request, and he tells Samuel, it's not going to work out for them, right? I'm going to give it to them, but it's not going to be good, right? So you can have two different things that you're asking for, and both of them are given by God, and you got to kind of be wise in the prayer request that you're asking, right? So then if you go through and read the rest of the trajectory of 1 and 2 Samuel, you'll see that when that verb sha'al is used to ask for something, every single time David asks for something, it is given to him. He asked the priests of Nob for like bread and, you know, a sword. They give him that. He asked Jonathan to hide his, you know, whereabouts with his father Saul. And Jonathan obliges Samuel's request and does not answer Saul's request. So everything David asked for, he's given. And every single time Saul asks for something, he is not given it. Every single time.
Mhm.
Until he goes to the witch of Endor, the
Right.
medium of Endor.
Yep.
So you have Samuel who's asked for, and he's a good and righteous request, right? Like Eli's like, oh, this is a good request. You have Saul who's asked for, it's a bad request. And then every single time David asks for something, he gets it. So David and Samuel are kind of like holding up the pillars of 1st and 2nd Samuel like that. And it's really kind of interesting way with the word asking.
Yeah, I think too they did. It'd be interesting to see what they do going down this line, because I'm working on some stuff for a project that I'm starting to research into depth that is a fascination for me at the moment, talking about the transition from the temple to the tabernacle. Or from the tabernacle to the temple. Sorry, my brain is fried from it's been quite a crazy week. But it is interesting that God gives them instructions for the tabernacle, but the temple is a request from David. And just you see this pattern over and over and over again of God giving people what they ask for. And then it's kind of like you get what you ask for, which is why, you know, Jesus is like, be careful when you ask in my name what you ask for, because you're going to get what you ask for. And that's aligning our wills with those of Christ, because there is not name it and claim it kind of like words have power in that kind of way, but our requests have weight, our requests have consequences. And it's really interesting to me, you know, to see what they do with that. They haven't brought the tabernacle, we haven't seen the tabernacle yet, which is I also think is kind of interesting. But I'm a tabernacle nerd, so that's one of my favorite things that I like to talk about. So, you know, just but this whole idea, you know, because the king wasn't the design, but they asked for one and they got one, and they were warned, you will get what you ask for. And we're seeing House of David play out the consequences of getting what you asked for. And the first attempt, Saul, was a disaster. David, it'd be interesting to see what they do with him. And Solomon, again, was a disaster because he ended up splitting the kingdom. Like, getting what we ask for. God gives us what we ask for, but that is a double-edged sword, because what if we ask for something in bad faith or without wisdom, the consequences can be bigger than we can even imagine. So it really is fascinating to me to see how they're going to play that theme out as well.
Yeah, like Solomon gets into trouble for a lot of the same themes they're setting up right here in these first couple episodes, is the syncretism, like with the other nations, you know, and not being totally, you know, kosher on not worshiping other gods or bringing other, you know, gods into your space. So yeah, so they're showing that Solomon's going to kind of pick up on some of Saul's themes if they go that far. But I imagine that the tabernacle will be a big reveal whenever they show it to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope we get to a point where they integrate seeing that the tabernacle and even the planning for a temple. I think that would be really interesting. On the theme of storytelling at large, especially on the biblical side, when you mention, because both of you talked about it, the idea of getting what you ask for and seeing the constant "I set before you today life and death," this bifurcation, right? That theme is played out a lot of times in scripture, and in a really interesting way. The instances that you guys were using reminded me of the Sons of Thunder and their mom being like, hey, can you give him a seat at your right and left hand? And he's like, you just don't know what you're asking for, lady. Yeah, they're you know, and they're like, well, no, we can deal with it, we can share your glory. He's like, you think you can drink the cup that I'm going to drink? You think you can? And they're like, yeah. And he's like, well, okay, now you will, but it's going to suck for you, you know? And it's like, that's terrifying, because again, what they're doing is fantasizing about things they don't understand, and then asking for things they don't understand. And so it's kind of like you're not ready for that fruit yet, son, but you'll get what you ask for. Right. You know? So the other one that's really interesting is the contrast of what the people ask for and getting what they ask for, which is Jesus, son of the Father, right?
Mhm.
And Jesus of Nazareth. So Jesus Barabbas and
Mhm.
Jesus of Nazareth
Yeah.
being the selection mechanism for Christ's condemnation before
Mhm.
Israel. And so it's interesting that you have these things thrown in the face of people, and you have these obvious moments of choice in which people are willfully and actively participating in the will of evil in order to accomplish what God is going to do with it. You know what I mean? And so it's a
Mhm.
very interesting thing to kind of tie back to something that we were talking about last week almost, is that God uses and integrates the reality of the gritty and messy chaos that humans inhabit,
Mhm.
and he didn't stay aloft from it. So much so that he's actually utilized it in many different occasions to bring about, in fact, what he intended in the first place. So Israel would be brought back to God. And how does he do that? It's like, well, he tells them, I'm going to anoint this king, and it's not what you don't know what you're asking for. It's not going to be good for you. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And then exactly what he says is going to happen happens later. And it's like, he's going to do this thing, and it's going to be a power struggle in politics, and all of the cult of personality is going to start to take place, this human dysfunction, because government is a structure, and if you make it inhabited with people, it's going to be fallible. Big shocker, right? And so it's like, when the people had the opportunity to be blessed by having God as their king, they still ask God for a king tangibly here. Lord, can't you bring one here? And it's ironic because God was not saying no. He was saying, yeah, just not one of you. I'm going to come.
Mhm.
Hold your horses, y'all, because the king did come in the flesh. We did have a Hebrew king born of a
Mhm.
woman,
Mhm.
a man, in fact. He's still the king now. He didn't fall like Saul did, right? Like, so it's like all of those things are so deeply rooted. This is how biblical storytelling is it's always that deep rooted callback. And
Yeah.
that's why there's such a big play, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, on remembrance,
Mhm.
to put back together something of old and to bring the past into the future with you, sometimes with altars and sometimes with sacrifices and sometimes with sacraments. But it's always bringing the past into the future with you. And which parts? It was God's faithfulness that you grab and you bring with you, you know? And so it's like those are the kind of things that if you understand these stories rightly, you're going to be taking from them that when we grab our sorrows and our traumas and we hold them like a backpack and carry them with us instead of the faithfulness of God, we're enacting evil rituals on ourselves in some real sense.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think that also goes really nicely with the idea and of why they chose a human king over Yahweh, who was supposed to be their king. Goes back to this pattern of pride, arrogance, and idolatry. Like we want a something. We want one we can see. We want one we can touch. We want to be like the other nations around us. That is the diversion of our hearts. That is a diversion of our affections. That is the diversion of our focus onto ourselves and something that looks like ourselves, a physical representation. That's what idolatry in the ancient world was, a physical container for their God, for their deity. And Israel wanted the same thing because their standalone Yahweh that Israel, I don't think ever understood the same way that the nations around them understood Yahweh. They wanted a physical Yahweh like everybody else, which was, and I think they did a nice job
Mhm.
because that is a big part of the theme of the rejecting of why Samuel, or God says to Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me by
Mhm.
replacing me as king. They are putting an idol on the throne, and they are putting an idol in the leadership of Israel. They are putting an idol in front of them. And every time we see that happen, it never goes well for people or for nations. For
Mhm.
Israel, every time they did that, it was a complete disaster.
Yeah. Another thing, like, I kind of almost wonder if they're going to go back to the coronation of Saul or the choosing of Saul, because that
Mhm.
would be interesting. Like, he was shorter in my head or like he was shorter in the depiction than he was in my head, right? Because he's supposed to be, a shoulder taller than everybody else in Israel. So that whenever we get to this Goliath situation, the fact that he won't go up and fight Goliath as the good warrior, the best warrior in Israel, is seen as like a failure of his kingship. But another place where the biblical narrative is just interesting in some of that episode 1, happenings, is that in Hebrew, whenever we're talking about like obedience, it's to listen to the voice of someone. Like that's obeying someone is to hear the voice of someone, to listen to the voice of someone. And that word is kol. In Hebrew, the word for voice is kol. And it also can just be the sound of a thing, right? So the kol of a storm is is thunder, right? The sound of a storm is thunder. The kol of a chicken is cock-a-doodle-doo, right? So, but when Samuel comes up to Saul, whenever he has, gotten the king of Agag and brought him back, and then gotten his sheep and brought him back, Samuel comes up to him, and the Hebrew word for what is normally ma, okay? But you can pronounce it meh. And if you are reading the cancellation markers in the Hebrew Bible, he says, meh, kol hazon haza. Like, meh.
Sound of a sheep.
What is the sound of this sheep that I hear?
Sound of a sheep.
He's like, meh, kol hazon haza.
Yep.
What is the sound of the sheep that I hear? And then he says that you did not, Shema, you did not hear the call of the Lord. So you heard the sound of this sheep, and you pursued the sound of the sheep and the sound of the oxen, but you did not hear the word of the Lord or the voice of the Lord. So it's really like, number one, it's funny, but then it is like that, knowing that he's about to like, chop Agag to pieces is like, whoa, this is like a serious moment at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, do we have any big last themes from the show we want to pull out before we jump over into interacting with biblical storytelling and narrative and jump out of the context of the House of David? Any big last thoughts before we move on to the bigger theme at large?
I'm really interested in the way that they are playing on the fear the Israelites, or at least some of them, have of the idea of giants. I thought because obviously Goliath is one of the most famous giants in the Bible. And what's ironic is that when you finally meet a giant in person, it's very far from Genesis 6, and so it's really interesting to see the way that they did that. I half expected the handprint on the wall to have 6 fingers on it, and so I almost like giggled to myself as I saw a 5-digit hand print on the wall or whatever, when they're seeing the giant handprint, and the little boy who's the survivor, which, by the way, that little boy I feel like is going to be an important thing that recurs later. I feel like he's going to be something of a callback to kind of reference the state of Israel to the people, because he played a really good way of showing this is what happens when a king becomes blind, is the people at the bottom suffer first. Right. This little boy who has no one to speak for him now, father murdered by, and so it's like the good king, who is the son of the blind king, which is an ancient, story theme. This is the blind king, and his son is the good king, and the uncle is evil, usually, and something like that. There's like this callback to something where you're like, okay, I think these themes are going to be ongoing. I think it's going to be something where you get to see and set the tone, right? So I feel like perhaps that little boy, because he's under Jonathan's care now, because Jonathan kind of was just like, no, I'll make him my problem. Just stop. I'm not going to have this conversation. He's my problem now. I'm taking him. I can take in this one. Right. And so I feel like because Jonathan seems to be putting himself over this boy, that he might by that become a servant in the house, right? Or at least if he's not adopted, something of like an apprentice or a servant to Jonathan personally, right? And so that gives credence for him being there at the episode with Goliath and seeing Goliath fall, and that being another, like this moment of victory and the child seeing the victory of God and a hope being restored momentarily and things like that. I feel like those are going to be themes that if I was doing it, that's what I would draw off of. I can kind of intuit that happening, you know. Yes, the pretty light is my microphone. This is the microphone. It's really cool, actually. It's very very cheap on Amazon if you want one. They're pretty cheap. But they work good. I think it sounds all right. But yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting possible big themes that they could pull on from the first couple of episodes. That I think would be worth revisiting. One of the ones that floated through the chat is maybe telling the story of what happens with Samuel's sons when you know, because it's alluded to in the beginning of the first the third episode, where Samuel is talking about, you know, maybe Israel would be different if I was just a better father, right? Like, and so you see Samuel the priest taking this like ridiculous ultimate responsibility. You know, if I was a better father, the world would be a better place. You know, like that's a profound sentiment. So you kind of, they almost hint at that they want to tell you that story as well. And so I'm hoping for a couple of things to come out. If I'm honest, those were things, those are strings that I'd love to see them pull on.
Yeah,
I was kind of. Oh, go ahead, Amber.
Okay, I was just going to say, I love that whole pulling that out, because you start to they build sympathy for Jonathan, like, oh, he's going to be a great king, and the fall of Saul prevents the rise of Jonathan, who we never know if he would have been a better king than Saul ever was, because Saul just removed it from his line forever with his unfaithfulness, and it's just kind of like, oh, but Jonathan. And it'll be interesting to see how they play that out, because it looks like he's going to be a much better king than his father. So, Courtney, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I thought it was interesting that they went ahead and brought in the Witch of Endor so early, and to kind of rid Saul of this evil spirit that he's been afflicted with. And I did think that one scene was kind of weird. I'm going to say that was a weird scene for me, with like, she was like dealing with a voodoo doll, it looked like. And I'm like, I don't know, that kind of feels like the Bayou to me, and not ancient Near Eastern culture. But being from like down there on the Gulf Coast near Louisiana, like I've seen plenty of those in my life. But yeah, and so yeah, so that was kind of, but I did think it was interesting, because I do think that would be the solution, kind of like in practical real terms, of like, if you're being afflicted by an evil spirit and you know that this evil spirit has been brought upon you by God, that you would not reach out more than likely to the high God, like to, you know, Adonai, to help you with that. So you probably would go and find that medium, which then sets up for how he knows where this medium even is, you know, whenever he gets down the road. And again, I thought that was interesting that they brought that in from Avner's, the Jewish like midrash is that his mother was one of these mediums. And so that's why he knew where to go and find a medium. So I thought that was cool that they brought him into that part of the story. Yeah.
Lore.
So, oh, what would you say?
I said deep lore.
Deep lore. I know they're going in that deep lore. And the other thing that I loved is that they went with that Genesis 6 interpretation and really went ahead and brought that in. I thought that was really cool when Achish asks Goliath's mother, like, I need to speak to their father, you know, and she's like, well, you'd have to talk to the gods, you know. To be like, oh, this is how they were born, you know.
Yeah, it's definitely
to think Shannon said someone is from Louisiana behind the scenes. JK, actually, it is kind of true. Father Stephen DeYoung was a consultant on this show, so, and he does live in Louisiana, although I do think that might be a detail that he's like, they didn't take my consulting work. Yeah, I do like.
I did notice that Abner was the dude from The Mummy, and he is one of the cool like throwback actors from my childhood. I really was very pleased to see his face.
I know, I love him too. He's one of my favorite like actors of that kind of genre as well.
All right. Any one last party shots before we move into the bigger theme at large here?
I think
we've covered a lot.
All right.
Go ahead.
Right, because I really want to transition into just the bigger topic of this. I think, how do we interact in a theology of art and beauty? Because, you know, there are so many rich and beautiful stories in Scripture that can be brought out, and how do we, doing that well, because they've, like, I don't want to get into these shows exactly, but, like The Chosen tried, and House of David is trying, and I haven't watched the one about Mary, but that one I think also tried. I can't
I don't
speak
think
to
the
how
one
well they
about
did,
Mary
or,
tried
but
as much as
did
the.
they? Okay.
I think that they tried the least. The Chosen is like
Uh-huh.
in the middle, and I think House of David is
Mhm.
on the top of the stack. Yeah.
Right. But how do we, using this, this amazing medium that's available, that has been done so badly for such a long time, that now people are starting to engage with this in a way that is appealing to people. I mean, the music from House of David was amazing. The music from The Chosen is very, it grabs your attention and you immediately associate it with the show. Like, there are so many things that we have, our vehicles, that can really spread the gospel all over the place, and the stories out of scripture all over the place. And how do we do that in a way that is faithful to the telling and the meaning and the message, and not get caught up in, well, they did all these little nitpicky details, or this isn't an exact reading of the, whatever my preferred version of the Bible is, or you can't speculate about things that aren't in scripture. How dare you have an imagination? Like, how do we walk that line between not going fully crazy with getting, whatever version of what we want, and staying faithful to the story? So, Josh, as our storyteller, how do we faithfully talk about these Bible stories to people who don't know them, and not, lose the meaning, but stay faithful, and not get stuck in details either?
I think one of the first thing that has to be adjusted is the cultural expectation,
Mhm,
that the Bible is going to be something that portrays only good. And so I
mhm,
think taking a raw and kind of gritty approach the way that they did in this show, I think is a step forward in a way that I think kind of shows the Bible is worth its salt and is way better than anything you've seen on TV, to be honest with you. And most of the stories you see on TV, or the ones that you've paid $20 to go see in the movies, they've just stolen main themes from the scripture and integrated it into a new character's life. And so
mhm.
ultimately, the Bible is the story of everything. And so I don't think that we necessarily have to do much other than just good storytelling to be able to capture what is in the Bible, because the Bible is real, And so if we approach the Bible in the based on a true story approach, and tried to use that as the way to mediate ourselves between the story and how to portray the story and how the story will be received, I think it'll be a lot more intuitive. Because a lot of the time what people try to do is try to establish, like, this story is going to be an evangelistic masterpiece that just baffles everyone into worshiping Yahweh. The first 5 episodes are just going to be, we're going to start a revival, like, no, first you have to tell the story, right? And so focus inwardly on the story. Make it the closed loop system that it is. They did great with the world building. Like, I think that's one of the things that's severely lacking in most Christian content prior to, let's say, the last 5 or 6 years. We've seen kind of an uptick in quality in the content that's been produced in the last few years, but a lot of it was because COVID kicked us into high gear as Christians and shoved us into our houses, and we were like, well, you know what, we need we need something that's going to keep us busy, that we can do with our money and our time, that like, I feel like I need to be involved in ministry now. And it's like, okay, well, then I'll donate to these things that are reaching people where they are in their houses watching TV, right? And so, sponsoring things like Angel Studios and The Chosen and stuff like that became, in some sense, a vicarious ministry opportunity to people, and it really amped up the process. And so I think that was a good thing. That was a good catalyst.
Mhm.
I think that was something that we could really use in a good way. And I think that if people started approaching the scripture like it was a terrifying and beautiful redemption story based on a true story, it would be
Mhm.
way better than trying to treat the Bible as this, like, okay, let me rephrase that. We should treat the Bible as sacred, but we
Mhm.
should not treat the Bible as though it were God. And so I think it would be wise of us to understand how to properly wield the Bible, and the real strength that it is to have the familiarity that we can have with the Bible, and to see, by way of not a stringent appeal to the text as such, but as an applicable version of understanding that is blood bought from of old, right? Like, it's impossible what we have. It's amazing. And so if we take it for what it is, I think people would be in a much better position, not only to receive it, but also to use it for telling stories. But it's like, I think some of the things that are going to happen in the first case is that people are going to start getting more and more obsessed with the historical emphasis of Bible telling stories, as though we were telling the story of the Bible explicitly. Because what we want in our modern idiosyncrasy is details, where in the ancient sense, icons were an entire series of stories, and not a snapshot of an individual detailed idiosyncratic moment.
Right.
And so that dissonance for us is going to have to be something that we get over eventually, because much of what's in the Bible remains implicit, and God intended it that way, because that's how meaning behaves itself properly. As soon as things are too explicit, it's knowledge, not wisdom, right? If that makes sense.
Right.
Because you can have it plainly stored in your head and then you never use it, and God catches you with a pocket full of seeds and no fruit. You know what I mean? So it's like, I think what we're gonna need is a way to integrate biblical principles back into good storytelling overall, and maybe come away for a while from an entirely historical emphasis on trying to tell the story of the Bible and as such. You know what I mean? Maybe telling some of these miniature narratives by expanding them, right? Because First and Second Samuel is quite minuscule compared to the entire narrative of the Scripture. Not that it's not a substantial narrative, and it's got a lot of detail in there for what it is, but it is not the whole narrative by any stretch. And I think that, when we saw initially, like, the History Channel doing the Bible series and things like that, they had a lot of high hopes and stuff for that when it was coming out. And it was like, okay, this was a truncated mess. Dang it, and so it's like, being too ambitious with the story, I think, harms itself. So what we should do is localize in an ordinate sense and try to be as based on a true story, kind of gritty as possible, because that's what's going to grab the modern attention, is the attention to idiosyncratic detail and grittiness and the gray area of moral quandaries and things like that, because that's what strikes us right now. That's what we're interested in right now. And so if we want to catch the attention where it already lives, appeal to those parts of the Bible that do so. I think that would be wise. That would be the best thing.
Yeah, I think that when you think back to what's been done in Christian storytelling, and what we've done to our own stories, like as a church, what we've done to our own stories is we put them in felt. We put them in felt, or we made those stories so sanitized that there was so much high fructose corn syrup, we could have had a pancake party. Like, it was just so sweet because we didn't want to deal with the own grittiness, like what Josh is talking about, in our own narratives. But then at the same time, like, one of the coolest franchises, like in my formative years, like kind of in high school, was the Lord of the Rings. And man, they brought in so much, attention and money. And, there was like this huge craft that went behind it, and everybody loved that. And even if you're like, I like the books better than the movie, you can't say that the movie was not good. Right. And if the movie was not doing something to be true to the book. Right. And that it opened up the world of people to that kind of fantasy genre. And like, we have that in the Bible. Like, Davidson was saying, like, we've got it pretty good. And it's a world that's foreign enough to most people that it does feel fantasy-esque. Like, it's not quite fantasy, but it feels fantasy-esque because it's like, set so long ago, and it has the supernatural elements. So we have to either, one, not be afraid of our own supernatural elements of the Bible, the things that are weird, the things that are gritty, the things that we feel like portray God in a bad light or portray us in a bad light, and just invite people into the story. And then the other thing that we did to our story, so if they weren't in felt and if they weren't covered in sugar, then we analyzed them to death. and said, do we even know if this detail is true? Which I love that they kind of played on that. I don't know if you caught that whenever Michal was saying, Dad, do you think that this really happened? And he's like, of course I do. Right. So they kind of played on that in that way. And I was like, it was a little bit smart to me, because I'm like, that's what most people think about these stories is, did it really happen? So that they don't ever even enter into the world, because they're trying to figure out, they're trying to analyze it first. They're trying to figure out what are the dates, and I think it's funny, like right off the bat, they went with the like early date for the Exodus, like the 14th century date for the Exodus, when it's like a lot of scholars want to argue for like the 1260 date. And it's like, that is an argument in scholarship and all this kind of stuff. And they're just like, we're going to tell the story. It's okay. I know somebody's probably going to be mad about this, but they weren't ignorant of scholarship either. Right. So they kind of respected the Bible for what it is, respected the world for what it is. They weren't trying to tear it down, and they weren't trying to sanitize it. Right. So that's kind of what you have to do to be willing to enter into that. And I think often as Christians, we do treat the word of God as if it's letters on a page, when the word of God is God himself, Christ. And because of that, Christ's story is more beautiful than we could ever imagine. And therefore that allows us that if we are handling the story rightly, then we can, as readers of the text and people who are inheritors of the text, like we're believers in this text is forming and shaping us. We can do that thing, like where we're creating icons, where we're seeing the overlapping narratives here, and we're bringing in images that wouldn't normally be together, because we're able to do this. I think we talked about this a couple weeks ago when we had Dr. Genelette on. Is it okay to do some of these things and to make some of these connections that are not implicit in the text, whether we're talking about in a movie or we're talking about like in preaching or something like that? And we talked about in the fact in the liturgy that they put together these two theophany verses, like where Isaiah, holy, 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 Lord Sabaoth, the whole world is full of your glory, where Isaiah is seeing God on the throne. And they also put that together with Jesus's triumphal entry, but with the Hosanna, behold the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And so right at the moment when you're seeing the Eucharist, and that exegetes the Eucharist for you, saying this is Christ here. And in the Western liturgy, they do a very similar thing, where it's John the Baptist's words when he says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, right at the moment when you see the Eucharist. So those are not Eucharistic texts. Those are not Eucharistic texts. But what they are doing is they are exegeting the Eucharist by putting those texts on top of it and saying, this is how you should interpret the Eucharist, right? And so are we then allowed to do similar things with our stories as we're retelling them? Or are people going to be like, that's not what the text says? That's not what the text meant in its original context. We're not allowed to do that. That's not in the Bible. And so I think we have to allow a little bit of interpretive freedom as long as we're being faithful. And I do think that by and large, it seems like the crew of this series was trying to be faithful to the stories that were given to them and to the world, right? Like, they're not grossly violating the world in ways that we could as moderns dissect it. So
I was thinking about, I've had several times over the last couple years, I get people who have asked me to referee arguments like, was Jonah real? Was Jonah a real prophet? And my answer is always, does it matter? In the story that the book of Jonah is trying to tell, does it matter if he's real or not? And I argue with them all the time. It doesn't matter if he was real or not. Now, personally, I think he probably was. But to the story of the book of Jonah, it doesn't matter if he was real or not. And that's one of the beauties, I think, that taking people out of this historical critical grip that has still on pop level. So preachers and YouTubers and stuff like that, historical critical still has a stranglehold on, is it factual? All of the details, digging out everything in a way that strangles the breathing room in the narrative. And that's one of the things that Courtney and I have been doing since the beginning, like pulling you out of that stranglehold of historical critical focus. And let's enjoy, there's wide open space all over the place in narrative. That there's some of these details, they're fun, and we love to nerd out on some of these details as well. But it does it matter in the narrative that's being told? Where is the story trying to take us? And it's one of the things that I think we have lost in being so left-brained all of the time. that we have lost the ability and the permission to be curious and to have imagination and to run free with that. It's stripped out of education on every level. It's even stripped out of media. It's stripped out of television. It's stripped out of video games. There's a lot of places that everyone in our Western context interacts, that this, you know, fostering of curiosity is lost. I mean, even to, I remember when I used to, for like a long time ago, be a director for preschool and childcare centers and stuff like that. And one of the first things I always did was get rid of coloring pages that had lines on them and just gave everybody blank paper. And I'm like, lines limit children's imaginations. Get rid of them all. I made them throw them all out, because I want to see what these children, I want to foster their imaginations and get them to start bringing those things to life. And when we've done that with the Bible as well, it's like, it's not this, we've turned it into an idol. We have made, it's supposed to be an icon that is a connection point that takes us to God. It is not supposed to be God itself. And I get so frustrated sometimes trying to explain to people, all these things. It's fun to talk about, but it doesn't, was Jonah real? It doesn't matter. Ultimately, it doesn't matter in the story. It's, and getting back to where we have permission to use our imaginations with the Bible, because there's so many people, when I say things like that, I get the nastiest comments back. Yeah. When you say you can have imagination and talk about, just some of the whimsy of the side that's not in the story itself. Because, one of the beautiful things about Hebrew is, if it's not important to the story, they don't include the detail. And there's so many things we don't know on purpose, because it doesn't matter to the story that God is trying to tell. So if it's not in there, don't worry about it. It's fun to think about, but don't worry about it. It doesn't ultimately matter. What matters was preserved. And this is where I think when we get to our, we've got a couple of videos planned in the future talking about like canon and the text and the history of how we get the Bible that we have when we get to that. But if you just think about all of the lives that have been sacrificed and people sacrificed to preserve what we have in front of us is absolutely amazing. And the fact that that narrative has been preserved the way that it has, in such fidelity, even with variants and translations and people who fight about my Bible's better than yours, you know what? The story's been preserved, and that's the amazing gift we've been given. And being able to take that and have a little fun with it and get into the story, the whimsy of story and the curiosity of story and the awe, the amazing, just, looking at Job, and when he pulls him, the imagination pulls him out, and he's looking at all of creation, and you're just like, imagination to look at pictures of the Hubble telescope and of NASA and the stars and constellations, and put yourself in that, and just have some fun with imagining some of these parts of some of these stories. Anyway, I go on about this all day, but giving ourselves permission to color outside the lines with Bible stories a little bit. I'm not saying completely make blue green and purple red. I'm just saying have a little fun with it. Have a little bit color outside. Yeah, enter into the color outside the lines a little bit. You're not gonna, you're not gonna set anything on fire. Nobody's gonna burn down a building because you color outside the lines a little bit.
Yeah, like I said, the way that I was kind of taught how to read these stories of scripture is to just always ask why. Like, again, Hebrew's really economic. Okay, so they don't say anything that they don't need to say, and if they repeat it twice, then they really want you to notice it. Yeah. So you need to just ask why, right? So why didn't Joseph contact his parents? Why didn't he tell his dad that he was still alive? So just keep asking why of the text, and as you ask why, or you look at what the geography is like, and you see, oh, this is why they're always going, up from Jericho to Jerusalem. And then there are times when you expect it to say they're going up, but they're actually going down. Okay, why are they heading down when it's actually geographically up? And there are reasons why. It's because you're moving away from the presence of the Lord, even if you're going upward, and things like that. So allow yourself to ask imaginative questions why, and what it would be like for you to be in that world. And so they're telling stories in these first 3 episodes that are not in scripture, and they probably didn't happen, right? And they even say that they probably didn't happen. This whole lion story with David in this way, it didn't happen. He definitely killed lions, but this particular way didn't happen. But that's okay, because it's allowing you to imagine what it would be like to have killed a lion in that culture while you're protecting the sheep and all these things. So it's allowing you to enter the world a little bit more fully. So yeah, like, be free, y'all. It's okay. But the words are meant to lead you to the word. They're always revelation about Christ. And so we shouldn't conflate God just with scripture, and we should see scripture as a part of the unfolding and unveiling of God in our world, so that we could see him. So as we notice these patterns, then we become more attuned to noticing how God is working in our own world.
You know, it's really strangely ironic in a very funny way to me. Like, I think I say funny because I think it's funny, is that the same people who will be upset about imaginative license being taken with the scripture are the same people that ardently think that if you envision Genesis 1 happening in any other way other than a time lapse, you're out of your mind. And it's like, bro, that technology didn't exist back then. When nobody would have had that visual. You're using your imagination, bro. That's what you're doing. Welcome to God waking up the faculty of your actual person, because that's what you do. You invest your attention and you use your mind and you extend into this thing. Everybody, especially when they're kids, they know how to do this. Go into your head, you build that little avatar of yourself, and then you have it go and do things. And the stuff that works out, boy, you try it out. And the stuff that doesn't work out, well, you don't do it and you stay alive. You let your thoughts, they can die instead of you. Like, that's where wisdom lives. Duh. Duh. If you can't invest your imagination into what scripture is doing, good luck loving God with all your mind. You can't. Hogwash. Calling your bluff.
Right. Exactly.
And like, this is, I don't know, I haven't watched The Chosen. I've like seen some things, written by people, so I can't really comment on The Chosen. I've just like, I guess watch some of the outrage when it annoys people. But I've also seen some people commend it. But what I'll say about some of the things that would annoy me if I were to watch The Chosen, because I just know myself, is some of the ways that it, portrays ritual purity culture in particular, and the sacrificial system and Judaism in the New Testament. I think it's probably better than most. But there are ways that people just have kind of negative associations with some of those things, like the woman with the issue of blood, where they're just like, freaking out. And it's like, it would have been kind of normal for her to be walking around. It's okay. In the ritual purity culture, it's actually not that bad. So yeah, there are ways in which this kind of genre of storytelling can still distort the Bible in people's minds. And people already have kind of this overlay of the certain way that we preach the Jewishness of Jesus that kind of gives them a distorted picture in their mind. So I just want to make sure that that's a little bit more faithful to the Hebrew scriptures, or to the Jewishness of Jesus and those kinds of things. That would be like my one caveat of like total imagination, because I do think that The Chosen has kind of imagined some things that shouldn't be there. But then, there are times when it's okay, so it just depends on how faithful you're being to the world. And I think a good scholar on The Chosen staff could have prevented that. And so, they're always going to make executive decisions where they probably decide to ignore the scholar. Like, if we asked Father Stephen, they probably decided to ignore him plenty of times. But it could have alleviated some of the really big ones, I guess.
Well, it's interesting, actually. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, but The Chosen do have a rabbi, an evangelical scholar, and a couple other people that are consulting on that.
Yeah,
and I am a fan of The Chosen.
Okay,
so
I don't know. Like I said, I don't know. I just know where my my sacrifice nerd scholars that I follow are a little upset about it. So.
Well, and there's some evangelical bent. That you can definitely tell that evangelicals are in charge.
Yeah.
But I think they did a better job than what has come before it of actually, getting people's imagination engaged. And I couldn't, one of the things that surprised me, because I watched it the first season expecting to hate it. And I found myself going, wait a second. And it drove me back into the Bible more than a lot of other things that I had interacted with for that, because it was like, wait a second. And then I went back and looked, and I'm like, okay, I'm okay with, I see what they did there. Not loving it, but I see what they did there. And the same thing House of David. I went back and reread First and Second Samuel just to be like, hang on a second, I don't remember that. Like, is this the story that they're trying to tell? So I give to Chosen big props because a lot of people have gone into their Bibles because of the Chosen. And I think hopefully a lot of people will go into the Old Testament because of House of David. Like, if it drives you to the Bible searching for truth, then they have done their job. And
yeah, that's what I was about to say.
Lighten up a little bit and just take off the gas, because this is the other thing I wanted to talk about here. And Josh, I really want to get your thoughts on this, because in especially in interacting with imagination and beauty, Christians love to be offended. It's like I go into something looking to be offended. Like, I want to be bad, and I'm going to find a reason to do it in these kinds of things. And we need to just knock it off. Like, knock it off. Stop looking to be offended, because you will be. If you're looking for beauty, you'll find it. If you're looking for offense, you will find it. So Josh, let's talk about that for a minute.
Which we probably set that up with our clickbait thumbnail too.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, as far as being offended, like, the reason I think people jump there, and we're often, even in a subconscious way, kind of looking for it, it's just cheap piety. To be honest with you, it's cheap. It's low-hanging fruit. You know, it's easy. It's unearned piety in some sense to be, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so free about admitting that I feel like I'm a bit of a prude, but I also know when, my own feelings of prudishness shouldn't interfere with the rest of the world. And I don't want to take up too much space anymore. I'm a very opinionated person. I'm sure people who've listened can probably gather that. I'm a very opinionated person, but I'm also a person who's realized that the rest of the world is insanely opinionated. And if I'm not going to take up more space than is actually granted to me, then I kind of just need to let that stand, and the tension lives somewhere between here and here, And so I have to be very careful, because I also have a sharp tongue, because words are tools, and so recognizing that there are lots of ways that you can go about things that don't have to be offensive on purpose. But yes, opinionated. That's my sister, by the way, if you guys didn't know that.
I did know that. Yeah.
That's my older sister. Yep. Yeah. I think that there are ways of doing things that don't have to be overly offensive, but there are things that when they first confront you are of their very nature offensive, and we should know the difference. And unfortunately, right now there's a huge hype in our culture, especially in the Christian world, by way of the political infiltration that's happened, is that the attention that we give to the political sphere and the right wing facts don't care about your feelings sort of crassness that stepped into a lot of people's speech habits and interactions, especially online. Yeah, keep trolling. That's what So I feel like people are going out of their way to let's say almost incite offense into people, to show it as some sort of a weakness, so that they can high five their friends and neighbors into the sunset while the other person's world starts to burn in their head, because you mocked them into a sufficient dejection that they no longer feel like speaking. And like it's very strange to see that people have done things like that, and people that claim the name are willing to do things like that, right? But also the fact that there are people on the opposite end of that spectrum who are so unwilling to cause any level of offense that they simply stay silent. And so unfortunately right now there's a void in the middle of people who are prudent enough to speak because speech is necessary, but wise enough not to speak in a foolish way. And so there are people who are too mousy to speak up, and then there are people who are too loud to shut up. And it seems like there's not a lot of voices in the middle. And so I think it's something that's worth thinking about, is the fact that we're going to see people being offended. And it seems like the reason why that's happening is, again, because it's cheap piety on every level. It's like, that's the political game as well. So it's not like that doesn't have its, everybody's doing, every 5 seconds, and so it's become a cultural fad in some genuine sense to be offended, to be
Mhm.
like this moral finger wagging is back in style in a very weird way. And so it kind of seems like that's where people are at right now, is
Right.
it gives them a feeling of power, either
Mhm.
to be offended or to cause offense, because this is what people do. I think it's honestly one of the best ways to kind of think about phenomena like that is like a mirror, right? When you look in the mirror, you're going to see what like what is relevant to you. What reflects back to you is going to be, in some sense, like a negative feedback loop from what it is you already are thinking, right? And so
Mhm.
that's what the internet algorithms are really doing to us, is they're making a funhouse mirror of our desires and showing it back to us. And if we want to be offended, we'll see offense. If we want to be pleased, we'll find pleasure. If we want to find workout videos, we'll find those. If we want to find music videos, we'll find those. And it's like, here it is, here's what you care about, it's all you're going to see now. And so, like, we do get kind of hyper fixated. It's
Mhm.
easy to get stuck in that, and so I think there's a lot of things that add to that. There's a lot that kind of ties people and tethers them to their immediate, I want to feel right about this, and so we bicker with strangers on the internet. or we sit down and watch a show and go,
Right.
what can I find that's wrong with this? The first thing I'm going to do is
Right.
Yeah.
and so, like,
Right.
we have to slow down. We have to just inhabit where we are, like, I feel that's going to be a big theme for a lot of things, because I'm noticing it coming up a lot, is we need to just slow down. We're doing it wrong.
We're doing it wrong. Yeah, no, that's a good word. No, I do like, so, I said I hadn't watched Chosen, and I said some of the people I've seen do some responses are, again, scholar nerds. Okay. Like, I'm calling myself a sacrifice nerd, and it's like, I know a lot of people don't know that information about sacrifice. Okay. So I'm not totally judging the Chosen. And I do agree with what Kyan philosophy said, is that, and the same thing that you said, Amber, that's what I was like, we were on the same train there, is that it causes a lot of people to go looking in their Bible. And these are stories that
Mhm.
shaped our culture. Whether we like are Christian or not, these stories shaped our culture. However, biblical literacy is at an all-time low. Like, a lot of people don't know where these common tropes and sayings come from, and that they're from the Bible. And so, allowing this type of medium, like this media and the Bible, to be portrayed in that way, will get people just like me being like, was it actually that violent when Samuel killed Agag? Right? And it's like, oh, I go back to my Bible and I look it up. And so that's me, and I'm somebody who reads my Bible quite frequently. Much less these people who are not biblically literate at all, never maybe shown an interest in the Bible, but now all of a sudden saying like, wow, that's kind of cool. I didn't know that was in there. Let me go check it out.
Mhm.
And so, if we're willing to, like, I don't know, let me, who is an 18-year-old, lead a Bible study, um, and tell people what the Bible said, and let me be wrong, it's okay. Like, God has enough grace for the
Mhm.
chosen, for that to be a medium through which people come to dig further into His Word. So, I'm with you guys on that, and I think it's easy to. Going back to like that supernatural comment, it's easy to attribute everything to the devil and never see anything of the spirit in the world.
Mhm.
And so it's easy to be outraged about these kinds of things and say they're not getting it right, and to not be see the ways in which it can be used for good, right? And to find the beauty in it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we also have to expand our tolerance for not we don't know everywhere God works. And so if God works in something that is outside of our experience with God working, who are we to say God doesn't work there? Like, how can I not say to someone who watches something that I don't like, but it takes them to a place where they find Christ? How dare I tell God where he can and cannot work? Like, that just is not a thing. That should not be a thing. We need to just, like Josh said, hit the brakes, pump it back a little bit, and sometimes there is room where appropriate offense can cause good change. It can cause a change of bad direction.
Mhm.
So offense in and of itself is not a bad thing. But if you go in looking to be offensive or looking to always be offended, because it's some kind of, I would be really interested to see some like research on this or something, the dopamine hits involved in being offended, and into our brains get addicted to being offense. The chemistry, brain chemistry evolved with offense, and to see if that's like a thing, or if there what it is about being offended that is so addicting to our culture and to us. It just seems like, we
It's Pavlov's bell.
yeah,
Mhm.
there's something to it there, definitely, that we need to just, I don't know how we shake people out of this addiction to this offensiveness. It not everything, you know, there is a place for offense, but it is not at every single thing that we see and everything that we read and
Mhm.
everything that we look at. Not everything is meant to be offensive, but
Yeah.
there is a place for offense, but not in everything.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting 'cause some of these people who will be quick to take offense and, like there's lots of different camps. I don't have like just one camp in my head, but we all see the outrage machine on Christian
Mhm.
Twitter or YouTube or the internet. So we're familiar with all the different camps that they are. Um, like they'll decry things like postmodernism or postmodern thought and how it's
Mhm.
negatively affected the church. But kind of like the essence of postmodernism is a critical spirit and like finding fault in things and having that critical worldview. And it just reminds me of this passage. So there's this book called Living in Wonder by this writer named Rod Dreher that talks about recapturing a spiritual worldview in the church in today's age after being disenchanted by a lot of these forces that we're talking about, like higher critical scholarship, a critical postmodern spirit to the world, and kind of the removing the supernatural from the church, so it just feels like empty moralism. And so he talks about that it's impossible to discount the role that the Reformation played in exiling the numinous, like the supernatural, from the collective consciousness of Western Christianity. Carlos Eyre, Yale historian, describes the earth-shaking paradigm shift brought about by Protestantism, one that overturned the spiritual and metaphysical model that had been uncontested in Christianity, both Eastern and Western, since the beginning. It gave rise to a disparate mentality that still saw reality in binary terms, but drew the line between religion and magic differently, rejecting the intense intermingling of the natural and the supernatural, as well as the material and the spiritual, thus placing much of Catholic ritual and piety in the realm of magic. Moreover, this Protestant mentality also involved a redefinition of the concepts of holiness and sainthood and a rejection of the assumption that self-denial and virtuous behavior could allow human beings to be gifted with supernatural powers. And so Protestants stripped God's agency from all miracles and gave credit to the devil instead.
Hmm.
And I think that that's what we could do with works like this, where we, strip it of its ability to move people and only see the negatives that it could bring instead.
But that gives you a lot to think about. And I want to just caveat that with, so we're not
like just
kind of
dissing on
bashing,
Protestants.
right?
We're talking about, I'm not dissing
Right,
on Protestants.
right,
I've been one for a while. I'm just talking
yeah,
about the
right.
the mentality that we're talking about and like where this comes from. We talk about the death materialism all the time
Mhm.
on this channel. So it's not a, beat Protestants with a stick moment. So
Death to materialism.
yeah.
I think that it all kind of goes together. This lack of connection to the supernatural, this discouragement of curiosity, the
Mhm.
squelching of imagination. Like we live in a world that is so, I don't know, flat and almost one-dimensional. It's not
Yeah.
even two-dimensional anymore. It's so one-dimensional that to get out of that box and to put ourselves where we are capable of interacting in 2D, 3D, 4D, it takes a lot of intentional work because it's not intuitive to our American culture of life, way of life right now. It's
Mhm.
just not. We all have phones,
Mhm.
we all spend, everybody's watching this. So you're not doing
We're
something that
participating in
they
the
could.
problem.
You're a maniac. Yeah, we are hypocritically contributing to the problem here. Like it is, this lack of these pieces that make the world and our life and our experience so three-dimensional. and it's been lost for quite a while, that many of us don't even know how to engage in trying to get back into that. How do we get back into, Josh, how do we get back into a narrative frame of mind, interacting with the world in a narrative? Because really, we are narrative. People are narrative. You think about, you go back and remember anything, and your brain will play it back for you as a story. We are
Right.
storytellers. We were created by a storyteller to be storytellers, and we have been removed from stories.
Which
Now,
again means that we perceive the world more like a ball of yarn instead of that binary, like he was
yep.
talking about, right? So we don't perceive them that neatly. So yeah, Josh, answer that question. That was a good one.
Answer the meaning of life. Go ahead. All right. Well, I think probably one of the first things that people can do is step away from the screens long enough to recognize that that's not where real life is. And we've forgotten that. We really have. We've kind of forgotten that. You know, most of us are kind of stuck inside this. I hate to say it, it's like the mirror on the wall, right? It's the magic lamp. I touch it, and what I want comes out of it. I need it for everything. It's my favorite slave, my favorite utility, you know, and it's very dangerous. You know, a lot of the time I think we're stuck in a place where we are not considering the future as such. And so when you forget the future, you fall into sin, to be honest with you, like in an immediate sense, in a long-term sense. Basically that's one of the main breeding grounds of sin, is being so rooted in the past that the present gets no attention, and forgetting the future and living in immediacy. Those are the two hugest problems that I see for a lot of people who are not recognizing the power that narrative has over their life. They don't recognize that they're being fed 1,000 different stories from the magic lamp in their hand. They don't realize that that's what's happening. They don't realize that in some sense, implicitly, they're acting out some of the stories that are most impactful to them. And that's guiding for them everything they see that's relevant to the goals that have been chosen for them by someone else. You know, and so it's like the first thing we need to do in order to step outside of that, I think, is, you know, go outside, go camping for a weekend. Just unplug, really, like, you know, unplug from the matrix and just be in real life for a second. Go and love your neighbor, you know, go and, practically speaking, this is how I would do it. Go and love your neighbor. Go and thank your pastor. Go and, you know, be kind to some lady who works at the bank. You just everyday things that you should and could be doing all the more often, that always seem like an interruption. When do you have the time to be a blessing? Dang it, make some, man. Go out of your way to be the thing that you wish was a commonplace part of reality. Be that thing. Whatever it is that stands out to you as that main offense, that main void. God, I wish there were more people that X, Y, and Z. Go X, Y, and Z then, man. Like, do it. Do the thing. That's it. Like, go and inhabit the story you wish was taking place. And not in this weird name it and claim it sort of way. I'm not talking about like enchanting reality with my words because thus saith the Josh. Like, I don't think that doesn't work for me. That might work for you, but I'm not that powerful. And so instead, what I do is I go out and I behave as though God is in charge. As much as I can manage, I go and I behave as though God is in charge, and I see what he does with it. And it does help me to be in remembrance of things, but the right things. It does help me plan for the future, but in a way that makes me integrate the fact that it's not my planning that does the future. Lord willing, as we understand, right? Is recognizing that I have a very loose grasp on the future, but when I forget it, my light is gone and I stumble much more because I'm not looking where I'm going. And so it's just like, be where you are, know where you're going. And if you can get those two things down, a lot of this stuff simplifies itself. A lot of this stuff. So unplug, Aim at something. First, small, meetable goals. It's the same thing I would tell somebody coming out of depression. Small, meetable goals. That's what you need. Small, meetable goals. That'll get you the proper dopamine kicks that aren't the cheap ones from the internet notifications. They'll say it. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Courtney, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say cultivating a posture of gratitude, because so what we talked about is it's way easier to have a critical spirit than to have a humble and contrite heart. And so cultivating that posture of gratitude, so that whenever you see that person who you normally are trying to, get past the bank teller so you can keep getting on your way with the rest of your life or something, then you recognize them and you're able to be a blessing. So I think pairing everything that Josh said with, in that moment, cultivating gratitude, so that whenever you see it, you can actually receive it as a moment of God in your life that day. Amber, do you got any?
I got so many things in my head right now. I'm trying to figure out which thread to pull on, because there's just so much that we could go on forever and ever and ever on this. But I think that we are on so many levels disconnected from, like, one of the things I love to talk about with people, and when we're talking about like the Old Testament and how people have a hard time understanding imagery and talking about narrative and talking about canonical narrative. I'm like, you just imagine all the stories and all the characters are just bookmarks. They're, because they're telling these stories as nomadic, semi-nomadics. And so the stars are like bookmarks. Characters are like bookmarks in this ongoing long story that was oral narrative for such a very long time, because that most places didn't have what we get spoiled because you've got phones that have apps with Bibles on them, and everybody, people have, I don't even want to tell you how many paper Bibles I have running around back in here. I mean, it's embarrassing how many of them I have, like and I could give them to you in multiple languages. Like it just, to me, it's obscene how much access I have to the written word. But this is stuff that came out of where you had to memorize the entire narrative, and you used the things in the world around you as those bookmarks to link to, with the hyperlinks that we talk about all the time. The nature was the hyperlink to the narrative. So you were tied to creation in these narratives with all of these things that interacted in a way we just don't anymore. I don't go outside and look at the stars up in above me and I'm thinking about the narrative story of Abraham and Joseph and of Genesis. I don't spend enough time doing that, because I don't have to do that, because I can go grab a Bible in a bunch of languages and in a bunch of formats, because it's always in my pocket. We've lost there's a very much a hyperlink to the creator, the imaginer, and I love, one of the things that I think my last thing that I'll throw out here that we talked about in Old Testament biblical theology in OTBT. When you look at Genesis 1, and the first couple words there, in the beginning, Bereshit bara. I'm going to get that backwards, but I'm just doing this off the top of my head. I'm not looking at it back, but one of the ways to translate that, we're so stuck on in the beginning, as in this is when time started and the beginning of the story started. Another way to translate that and to think about that, because that word can also be head. So it can also be translated as from the imagination of God, or from the thought of God, or from the, it cannot have to be anchored in the beginning of, as the time starts in this story. It can be from the imagination, from the creativity of the creator. The world was brought into being. And we've, and not thinking about that there is that inherent link to the imagination built right into the first two words of the Bible, is such a beautiful thing that we need to just, I would love to go back to the idea of interacting with the narrative. Just let go of the control of the details a little bit and enjoy the bigger picture. Enjoy the tapestry that is woven through scripture of this beautiful story, garden to garden, because it is amazing. So anyway, We are hitting about 2 hours here, so,
Yeah. We need to answer Kyan's question. It's been like an hour since he asked it. So.
yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I'm assuming, I don't know.
Shame.
Kyan sounds like, I don't know, might be a lady. I have no clue. It might not be your name. It might just be your handle. So, yeah. So he says, I always thought that God was initially okay with Israel having a king, but I was incorrect in that. Was it just a lack of faith in God that made them want a king? So I've got an answer. Amber, you got an answer? I think we might have
Why
different
don't you I think you and I probably have a very similar answer, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. So,
With that.
my first answer is like, yes, God's okay with him having a king, but that's how I would say that. Yes, God's okay with him having a king, but, and why is that? Because in Deuteronomy 17 is when we get the instructions for how to be as king, right? So
Mhm.
there's already instructions for how to rule and reign as king over Israel and what a righteous king would be like. However, it says God himself will appoint for you a king
Mhm.
in Deuteronomy 17. And the God himself is like emphatic there. He is going to do this. He will tell you when it's time for a king. So then whenever you get to Samuel chapter 8 and they're asking for a king, they are asking and God does appoint Saul, but it's not the time. It's not the right time for the king. So that's why it's disobedient in that moment, and that's why it will have these negative effects, because he can see that Saul, or that the kingdom has all these pressures from around, and they're going to want to go back to Egypt to get chariots and all these things they told them not to do to fight their enemies. And if they just trusted in God, God will continue to fight their enemies for them. So this was not the right time for a king. That's what I would say. I don't know.
Yeah,
Is that your answer too?
yeah, basically they're trying to get what they're not ready for, which is a
Mhm.
theme from Genesis 3 all the way through. We see
Mhm.
it over and over and over, trying to get what we want before we're ready for it. God, not trusting in God's
Yeah.
timing. So, yeah.
So, yeah, God said this is going to happen. And what does Abraham do? He tries to find his own way to get it to happen, right? Like that's kind of how it is. It's like God
Yep.
makes the promise and we try to figure out our own way to get to the promise. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up with channel plugs and then call it a night.
Yeah.
So, Josh, final thoughts. Wrapped up the thoughts of all of this wandering,
Oh, wait, we
meandering
had
that
this
we've been
question
doing
from
here.
Shannon
Oh,
too.
we do? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I'll show it.
Oh, I missed it. Okay.
So Joseph and his brothers, could this be an example of wheat and tares growing up together and all finally bowing down to Christ in the end? I hadn't made that connection before.
Yeah, I
But
hadn't. I have to think about that
I'll
some
have to
more.
think about that. But there are the sheaves bowing down,
Mhm.
like that. So it could be. It could be. I'll have to read that parable again, thinking about
Mhm.
Joseph in mind, and see if there are any like linguistic connections there. But it sounds fruitful, Shannon. That's what I would say. Sounds like a fruitful connection to try to track down.
Well, they are the tribes,
Yeah, they are.
They were definitely of a fruitful character.
Yes.
And so
That's very true.
Israel itself is in some sense a living example of the wheat and the tares.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of Paul's underlying points in Romans 9, is kind of exposing that. Like, we've seen from the beginning that there was, like you would mention earlier, the controversy with Moses and Korah. It's like, that's pretty wild,
Mm-hmm.
As far as Kyan's question, I think one of the things to remember in scripture is these are real people doing what real people do. And what do real people do? We don't just desire evil. We desire good in the wrong way or too much. And so not just before our time, but also it was that they wanted a king incarnate. And God said, yep, that's my plan. They were like, but we want it now. And he's like, no. They're like, yes, we want to be like the other nations. And he was like, no, the covenant is that you wouldn't. Probably not. And then they're like, no, we want a king. We want a king right now. And he's like, okay, but this is what's going to happen. And so he gives them every opportunity not to do the thing, and so it's an image of that overall, kind of, I guess you could call it the infection that we were talking about earlier, this kind of like the spreading of that corruption in some sense, right? Where it's like humanity wants good things because we are image bearers and we're made to be like God. That's what we were made for. And yet in desiring good things, Satan knows exactly how to pull the passions. You know what I mean? And so that's That's ultimately what I would say is they were looking for the incarnation. That's why they wanted a king. But they understood the incarnation wrongly, as many people do. And so it led them astray. And so I think in some sense what they were doing was following the heartache that Jesus can solve, but not recognizing that God was doing it his way. So kind of a combination of those two. So same as your answer, but a little bit, other direction. But overall, I think
A little
the
more Jesus-y, so probably better.
Huh?
A little bit more Jesus-y, so probably better.
Jesus, I love Jesus-y things.
Yeah.
I used to have a joke with my friends when I was a teenager, because I'd go to youth group like 5 times a week, and I had friends that'd be like, "You just go in there and like, what do you do? Like, what do you do? You just go there and every single time you do the same thing?" I'm like, "Yeah, we talk about Jesus and Friends." Like, what do you mean, bro? It's my favorite show, And so like it's just one of those things where kind of it's always been with me to love things coming back to that central focus. So it's easy to go back there because he fills everything. But as far as like the way the conversation kind of moved from the show to narrative at large, and from narrative at large to our lived experience in the narrative, let's say we're right now where we are culturally, what we're experiencing presently is that disjointed, self-oriented, way too fast living in a shell-shocked world of digital spaces where like nothing has a real face. Like the internet is the world of postmodernism. It just is. Like we live there now, and we made it real for ourselves, and then we just inhabit it all the time, and so it was pointed out, I think it was Shannon that said, we get to a place where we have too much at our fingertips. Bringing it back to the show, the lazy brother of Jonathan was this decadent, real just piece of work, too much at his fingertips had led to a corruption before they even allowed for the corruption to enter the camp. It was him putting words in the ear of his father that brought about them keeping the Amalekite things. He was speaking for the people, right? And I was struck by the part when they're talking together, and Jonathan is like, "You brought these cursed objects into the camp." And he's like, "They're rather shiny for being cursed, don't you think? And besides, Father didn't put up any objections."
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, no, you have way too much access to the world. You've forgotten it's real. You've forgotten it's real, sitting here lounging on your pillow with your wine. You forgot about real life. Like that's very much what we've done. That's very much what we've done.
Courtney,
I think Josh had a really great summary of like the episode at large, talking about being connected to physical objects in the Bible world. These are just things that I've had hanging around this whole time and didn't have another time to bring them up. But here are some smooth stones. Here's one smooth stone, another smooth stone. From where they would have fought the battle, David and Goliath. So these are real. These are from Israel, from there, and they are so smooth. Like I've just held it in my hand. I held them in my hands the whole time, like little fidget things, because they're just like really easy to move around in your hand and like between all your fingers, all that kind of cool stuff. So they are really nice and really smooth and flat. I don't know if you can see how flat they are. They're pretty flat for smooth stones. And then this, my husband is going to be so proud of this. Okay. So I'm going to give him all the shout out for this. So whenever we were, traveling through the Valley of Elah, where we picked up the smooth stones, then we went up to this hill with this ancient city called Sha'araim. And when you're reading that David and Goliath story in 1 Samuel 17, it says after David kills Goliath that they chased the Philistines through the valley, through Sha'araim. And so Sha'araim is on the hill right as the edge of the valley is coming out towards the sea. Like the Mediterranean Sea. And they discovered the city, a while ago and excavated it. And whenever you do an archaeological dig, you have all of this scree, which is like leftover pottery that is not a whole pot. So they're not going to take it and go in a museum, and it's just a pile of pottery off to the side. And so as we were walking up the hill, our tour guide was like, "Hey, if you guys want to take a piece of pottery from Sha'araim, like you can take it home." which is of course like, yeah, everybody's like, I'm going to stop and take home a piece of pottery from here. That's
Wow.
really cool. Okay. So
Yeah.
the whole time we're up there, it's like a whole hour that we're listening to this lecture about David and Goliath and all this kind of stuff and how that all works out. My husband is like digging through this pile of pottery. Like he is not paying attention to the lecture at all. And as I'm coming back down the little, mound, he comes up to me and he's like, look at what I found. And he holds up this thing. He holds up this right here. He's like, look at what I found. And I was like, it looks like a piece of pottery. Like, that's what it looks like. We all grabbed our piece of pottery like an hour ago on the way up. And he was like, no, all of these chumps just grabbed like a triangle that looked like this. And he's like, I sat there and I found a handle. I don't know if you could tell it's like a handle. So he's like, I found a handle. It's not just a triangle. And he's like, I found the coolest piece of pottery in the
Nice.
pile.
Nice.
So
Guarantee you're touching history sands right there. Yeah.
I know. So he was so proud of it. And of course, I get to show it all the time whenever I teach Hebrew. I mean, you can even like see where it was connected to the pot right there and everything.
Mhm.
And so I show it all the time to my students. And so I get to brag about it all the time. And but he had the fun finding it. So those are some of my closing thoughts. I'll leave them there.
Yeah. I would say try it and see. Try it and see.
Mm-hmm.
Experience is breaking you out of what you're normally used to. So just try it. You don't have to sit and watch it if you don't like it. Just try it.
Mm-hmm.
Try something different. Try something you wouldn't normally, and just give it a minute. Tolerate, get to where you can tolerate, and then try 2 more minutes, and then you can bail on whatever it is. But just try. That's what we, and then just for a couple things wrapping up here real quick. So Josh, Cosmic Corner, what is happening?
The third Friday of the month, which is hold on a second, today is the 7th, so it would be the 21st. So the 21st, I have to verify with Jalen that date still works. So tentatively on the 21st, we're going to be continuing the conversation about narrative and the problem of evil. And so that's going to be something, if people didn't see that last Friday, we did an episode about the problem of evil through a narrative lens. And we did this huge sweeping 10,000 foot view, like I really love for the Cosmic Corner thing. And so I feel like for the next couple episodes, we're going to probably fixate in on a couple of, examples, let's say, kind of explore some of the landscape that I was seeing the whole thing. There was a lot in that episode that I was very pleased to be able to take apart. Got some really great clips out of there that are by themselves freestanding nuggets of wisdom that I think are really worth having. And so I intend to expand on some of those. And so I'm expecting it's going to be a really good conversation. By the way, both of you are also fully allowed to be there for that if you so choose, but you are not obligated.
Thanks for the invite.
All right. So Courtney, we've got some stuff coming up. Hebrew Bible Breakdown and Kairos has got some stuff coming out that's been really interesting to see what you guys have coming out on that channel. So what's up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what's coming out on Kairos. We did just recently do a video on Psalm 23. We have a video on some of these narrative patterns in Samuel, if you want to check that one out. That one's pretty cool. Another narrative pattern video that I really like is it's called Pilate's Wife Had a Dream ? Like why was it significant that Pilate's wife had a dream, and tracing that narrative pattern through scripture. So that one's pretty cool. So that's on our channel, Kairos Classroom. And if you're interested in taking Biblical Greek and Hebrew, we have signups coming. We're starting a new round of classes at the beginning of April, so check them out. And then, yes, on this channel, we're going to have an episode on Torah, like reading Hebrew Bible and the importance of Torah for understanding the Hebrew Bible. We're going to have some episodes on how to use Bible software with, I think Nick Quint will be coming on for that one. Then let's see, what else do we have? We need to reach out.
We got some Hebrew Mind stuff coming up. We got Hebrew Truth, Hebrew Time. We're going to talk about the importance of the Septuagint, and our friend Spencer is going to join us to talk about the emotional impact of reading the Old Testament. So there's going to be some really good stuff. We're going to have our friend Josh Sherman's going to come. We're going to talk about the canon, the canonical order, how you read things, and all of the confusion around canon and whose canon and do we use, and that's a big fight that we're gonna kind of dip our toe in that a little bit. So yeah, we've got some fun stuff coming out.
Maybe Carrie rejoining us again to talk about some biblical animals.
Biblical, yes, animal imagery in the Old Testament. That one's going to be fun. So yeah, our segment here, we got some really good stuff coming out. We're going to have Josh come back and talk some more about storytelling, because I think it's going to be it's an important thing to keep talking about. To be, and I want to do an episode. Normally we focus on Old Testament, but I have a friend who's working on a PhD on New Testament, the narrative of the New Testament, because I think people forget about that. All of it is a narrative. Even the stuff that is letters to people addressing problems adds to the narrative. So we're going to talk about that some more too.
And if I could drop another shameless plug for the Cosmic Corner playlist, I have recommendations that are relevant to what we're talking about here. If you want to know more about why it is that narrative is such a crucial thing about what we're talking about, there are a couple of episodes on the Cosmic Corner playlist. Number one being narrative structure in the book of Exodus, which I super recommend. Also, Joshua Sherman and Garrett Skidema was on that. That was one of my favorite things that ever happened in the entire world. And then also I have a part 1 and part 2 about the Garden of Eden as a cosmic structure. Those are also very useful tools for understanding some of the bigger picture themes and items and how they form a cohesive whole, right? Those episodes for me were really great foundational building block episodes for articulating some of the stuff that I talk about all the time on Cosmic Corner and did talk about a lot here. And that's how I'm using and employing some of those things. So foundationally, those are really good reference point episodes for some of the stuff that I do on Cosmic Corner that we were doing here also.
I feel like your death to materialism episode is also really good in some of what we talked about here, like just rethinking how we actually think and frame the world. That's true. That's true. I mean, just check out the Cosmic Corner playlist in general. But when I'm talking about narrative wise, those are the ones that stuck out to me. And so you're right, though. The death of materialism episodes are really good for the perspective shift question that Amber asked me. Those are really like a very long treatment of something along those lines. So yeah.
And then on my channel, When Deep Calls Deep, I've got some really cool stuff. So Josh and Garrett are going to come and we're going to talk about narrative some more on there, because my channel is all about narrative and all about Old Testament. So we got that's going to be really fun. We got a Doctor Who reference going there. It's going to be really, really fun. I'm really excited about that. My friend Ronnie's coming back and we're going to do some more stargazing and look at some more Butterfly Nebula and look at just some more of amazing God's creation stuff going on. I've got Sean Schulte's going to come do a fun episode. We're going to talk about some stuff and he's going to tell some of his story. And we're going to do, and then a friend of mine, Adam, who is another Old Testament nerd, is going to come, and he and I are going to do a 4-part series, just kind of walk you through what is Torah and why does it matter. Leviticus, why Leviticus matters, has got an episode 2 coming out in a couple weeks, so that'll be a lot of fun. So Courtney and Spencer and Phil and I are getting back together, getting back together for a part 2, and that's going to be really good. And then part 3 will be coming out later after that about Jesus in Leviticus ? So that's going to be, I'm looking forward to that as well. So my channel's got a bunch more stuff coming out lately. Ramping that up. And then one last thing I wanted to bring up to everybody's attention, because our friend Tyler, who normally is here with us on Fridays, is not, but this is a link to the GoFundMe for his wife Lacey is in need of some implants or some dental work that really is going to help alleviate some pain and suffering for her. So if anybody's able to contribute anything at all to helping them out to get that, we are trying to, as a, one of the things I love about Faith Unaltered, the crew here tries to take care of each other. And so many people in the crew are going through a lot of tough stuff right now. And this is just one way that you can actually put some of that into action, is contribute, just even $1, towards trying to help them out. That would be great. yeah, because there's so much going on. And poor Lacey. There's just you can check it out. It's legit, and it help out Tyler and Lacey in that way. And I think everything on everything that I had on my list. So Courtney, any wrap up thoughts there for our and you always remember the tagline and I never do, so I'm going to let you close this out here.
Yeah, connecting you to the scriptures one hyperlink at a time. Yeah, so that's my wrap
right.
up. That's what we're doing. We're connecting you to the scriptures one hyperlink at a time, and you guys will all remember the meh, go on something like that.
Right.
That's what you'll all remember is that he's like making fun of the sheep sound. So that's our hyperlink for today.
That's amazing. All right, everybody, have a great weekend, and we will see you back in 2 weeks, back on our normal Wednesdays. And tomorrow next Friday is open mic night on Faith Unaltered Friday night. So come jump on with us. Josh and I and whoever else is around are going to be running the show because Tyler's taking a couple of weeks off. So come join us for open mic night next Friday. It's going to be a blast. All right, everybody, have a good one. And thanks for joining us.